I want to thank the fun and challenging Best Fiends for their support. If you've listened to the show for a while, you know I'm obsessed with Best Fiends. So stop crushing the same old candy and try a puzzle game with something fresh to offer. Download Best Fiends free today on the App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Enjoy the episode. June 12th, 1987. Flagstaff, Arizona. After finishing her shift at the Flagstaff Medical Center, 40-year-old Navajo woman Sarah Saganitso never returns home, and her nude body is found in a nearby wooded area the following day. Her exact cause of death is asphyxiation via suffocation, and there appear to be bite marks around her left breast. Nearly 2 months later, a suspect named George Abney is charged with the murder after making a confession which he maintains was coerced. At trial, Abney's defense team alleges that the crime is linked to witchcraft and was committed by a Navajo skinwalker. Since the jury winds up acquitting Abney, the actual truth about Sarah's murder remains up for debate. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be looking at what is undoubtedly one of the most bizarre crimes we've ever covered on this podcast, the 1987 murder of Sarah Saganitso. Throughout the month of October, I've been counting down to Halloween by releasing episodes about unsolved cold cases which are alleged to have ties to supernatural elements, and debunking some of the misinformation and sensationalistic details which have sometimes spread about these stories. Well, today's case may be the only documented murder trial in which the defense tried to pin the blame on a skinwalker. In case you're not familiar with the term, the skinwalker originates from Navajo lore, and they are described as being evil practitioners of witchcraft who use magic powers to shapeshift, possess, or disguise themselves as an animal in order to inflict harm on others. The victim in question was a Navajo woman named Sarah Saganitso, who was murdered in an extremely brutal fashion after finishing her shift one night, and even though a suspect named George Abney would be charged with the crime after confessing to it, his defense team alleged that the confession was coerced, and the scant evidence against Abney was flawed. Sarah's murder supposedly contained a number of odd details which suggested the use of Navajo witchcraft and the potential involvement of a skinwalker, which is why the defense presented it as an alternate scenario at Abney's trial. Well, I'm sure many of you are probably rolling your eyes at this whole situation, but the jury found Abney not guilty of the crime. There's surprisingly very little information about this case online, and since the few sources you'll find out there have greatly exaggerated certain details, you might be wondering if this whole story is nothing more than an urban legend. However, I can verify that this trial received extensive coverage at the time in such newspapers as the Arizona Daily Sun and the Arizona Republic, so I'm going to break down the whole case from beginning to end on this episode and try to figure out who or what was actually responsible for this murder. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the death of Sarah Saganitso. Our Our story begins in Flagstaff, Arizona in 1987, and our central figure is 40-year-old Sarah Louise Saganitso. Sarah was originally born on the Navajo Nation reservation in the unincorporated community of Tuba City, and hailed from a large family with 7 brothers and 7 sisters. Sarah moved to Flagstaff in 1966, and currently lives in a trailer park as a single mother, raising her 4-year-old son, Elvin. For the past 17 years, she has been employed as a housekeeper at the Flagstaff Medical Center, and is described as a quiet, reserved woman who doesn't socialize a lot with her fellow coworkers, but is also a responsible employee who does her job efficiently. Sarah has spent most of her tenure at the hospital working the day shift, but after taking some retraining for 6 weeks, she is scheduled to work her first night shift on Friday, June the 12th, which runs from 3 p.m. until 11 p.m. Sarah showed up that day and did her job as usual, and was last seen by a hospital custodian at 10:55 p.m., 5 minutes before her shift was scheduled to end. However, no one could actually confirm having seen her leave, and she never arrived home. Some of Sarah's relatives became concerned enough to contact hospital security, and after they performed a search for her, they discovered that Sarah's pickup truck was still parked outside, even though there was no sign of her anywhere. When she failed to resurface by the following morning, she was reported missing to the Flagstaff Police Department, and her family, friends, and coworkers launched their own search of the area surrounding the medical center. At around 2:30 p.m., a coworker discovered Sarah's nude body between some rock crevices on a wooded hillside located about 100 yards from the hospital's southwest parking lot. She had a number of wounds on the left side of her torso, and her face was so badly beaten that she was almost completely unrecognizable. The tip of Sarah's left breast was missing, and it would later be ruled that the wounds on her chest were bite marks because someone had bitten into her. Susan's clothing could not be found anywhere at the scene, and all of her personal items, including her purse, identification, eyeglasses, jewelry, hearing aid, and canvas bag, were also missing and were never recovered. The Coconino County Medical Examiner's Office ruled that Sarah's exact cause of death was asphyxiation via suffocation, though tests could not conclusively determine if she was sexually assaulted. For over 2 months, there was little progress in the investigation, but on September the 1st, a 35-year-old suspect named George William Abney was finally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Abney originally hailed from Sioux City, Iowa, and had served 4 years in the Air Force and did a stint in the U.S. Naval Reserves during the 1970s. In 1986, Abney graduated from Northern Arizona University with a master's degree in English, and he'd also been teaching freshman English there as a teacher's assistant. According to those who knew him, Abney was a good student and teacher at the university, though he would sometimes share strange stories about his troubled childhood with his classes. At the time Sarah's murder took place, Abney had been living in the same neighborhood as the Flagstaff Medical Center and moved out and traveled to South Carolina a short time later to stay with his parents. At the time of his arrest, Abney was unemployed and hoping to accept a new teaching job in China, and when he was first questioned by police, he had returned to Arizona and was living in a hotel in an unincorporated community outside the town of Sierra Vista. Abney first popped up on the radar as a potential suspect in mid-August when he phoned Floyd Patterson, the minister of the Flagstaff Tabernacle Church, where Abney had previously attended. Abney told Patterson that he had been plagued by a disturbing dream and was having a difficult time separating fantasy from reality. He said the dream involved a Hispanic man murdering a woman near a hospital, and when he saw a newspaper article about Sarah Saganitso's murder, he became disturbed by how many details of the crime seemed to resemble his dream. According to Patterson, Abney felt that these dreams were a quote-unquote message from God, as there were so many similarities with the murder that he believed he quote-unquote could have done it, and was planning to commit himself to a mental hospital in Tucson for treatment. Well, it turned out that Patterson's son-in-law just happened to be Gerald Blair, a detective for the Flagstaff Police Department, so Patterson contacted Blair to inform him about what Abney had said. Investigators traveled to Sierra Vista to question Abney, and he voluntarily agreed to return to Flagstaff for a second interview at the police station. After a 10-hour interrogation session, Abney made a videotaped confession to Sarah's murder and was subsequently charged with the crime. When Abney made his first appearance in court, he was asked if he was aware of the first-degree murder charge against him and responded in a rather perplexed tone, stating, quote, This is what I'm told. After being indicted by a grand jury, Abney was held without bond at the Coconino County Jail for the next several months, and his trial would begin in Coconino County Superior Court on June the 21st, 1988. The case would be prosecuted by Deputy Coconino County Attorney John Thompson, and Abney was represented by defense attorneys Bruce Griffin and Donald Bales Jr. In the weeks following his arrest, Abney remained uncertain about whether or not he actually committed the crime, but by the time the trial started, he was convinced he did not do it, and his confession was false. The defense had made an unsuccessful attempt to have Abney's confession thrown out, arguing that as a minister, Floyd Patterson had violated confessional privilege by sharing the statements Abney made to him with the police. Since Patterson's son-in-law, Detective Blair, was also a parishioner at his church, the defense believed that both men had manipulated Abney's religious faith in order to coerce him into a confession. In fact, at one point, Abney asked Patterson to be brought into the interrogation room to counsel him before he made his confession. However, the court ruled that since Patterson had founded the Flagstaff Tabernacle Church and never instituted a confidentiality policy regarding confession, Abney's statements would be allowed into evidence. The prosecution would also present testimony from a waitress friend of Abney's who claimed that he had obsessively talked about Sarah's murder with her on multiple occasions after reading about the crime in a newspaper article. And before he was even looked at as a suspect by the police, Abney had written a 5-page letter to another friend in which he expressed his belief that he might have murdered an innocent woman. One passage read, quote, "Circumstances found me absent of conscious volition and my hands at the life of another human being I killed. I did not hold malice toward the woman who died. I did not know her. Her misfortune and my own was that she was there. I pray for forgiveness." End quote. Nevertheless, the defense would attempt to discredit Abney's confession at trial, arguing that detectives had manipulated him into it by asking leading questions. They brought in Dr. Richard Offshee, a professor from the University of Berkeley in California, who is considered to be one of the foremost experts on false confessions, coercive interrogation techniques, and false memories. Offshee has since provided his expert testimony in a number of wrongful conviction cases, and he pointed out a number of issues with Abney's confession. At one point during the interrogation, Abney revealed that he was molested when he was 6 years old, which caused him to deal with stress by slipping into a sleep-like state. Detective Blair then suggested that Abney's past childhood trauma might have caused him to develop split personalities, which is why he could not remember committing the crime and only had vague recollections of the event in his dreams. But one of the biggest issues with the confession was that Abney often revealed inaccurate details about the crime and kept changing his story. Abney's original version of events was that he had visited the Flagstaff Medical Center to seek treatment for depression and was very upset when they denied it to him, but he crossed paths with Sarah, who offered to drive him to a bar and a liquor store to hang out for a while. Afterward, they returned to the hospital, but Abney said that Sarah started massaging his neck, which he did not like. When he resisted her advances, Sarah responded by hitting him, which caused him to become disoriented and black out, and the next thing Abney remembered, he was standing over Sarah's body. But one of the problems with this story was that there were no witnesses who could recall having seen Abney at the hospital that night or the bar and liquor store he had mentioned. Abney said that Sarah had been dressed provocatively that night in traditional Native American-style clothing, even though she would have been wearing her work uniform throughout her shift, and there was no indication she brought a change of clothing. Throughout his interrogation, Abney made no less than 8 wrong guesses about Sarah's exact cause of death, and at no point did he ever mention the correct cause, which was asphyxiation by suffocation. Even though Sarah was not stabbed, Abney implied that he did stab her when he made the statement, quote, "Every wound I put on her body after she was dead corresponded with the way I felt, things that have happened to me," end quote. Abney also made a number of other wild claims during his confession, including that he dressed in a set of green surgical scrubs while he committed the murder. After spattering himself with blood, Abney said that he went into the hospital men's room to clean himself in the shower, and even though a forensic search of the bathroom did uncover some bloodstains, it was a completely different blood type which did not match Abney or Sarah, and none of the fingerprints found in the bathroom matched Abney either. Overall, there was only one piece of physical evidence from the scene which seemed to match Abney, and it was a pretty controversial one. One of the main reasons the grand jury decided to indict Abney for murder was because of a report by Dr. Raymond Rawson, an odontology expert who also happened to be a Nevada state senator. Prior to his interrogation, Abney had agreed to a dental examination in which impressions were made of his teeth, and they were submitted to Dr. Rawson for a comparison, prompting Abney to say, quote, "If they do come back positive, I guess I'll need psychiatric help." Well, Rawson reported that Abney's dental impressions were consistent with the bite marks on Sarah's torso, though he said an additional analysis would be required for a more definitive conclusion. However, the detectives neglected to reveal that point during Abney's interrogation and told him that the bite marks were a positive match, which is what prompted him to ask to speak to Floyd Patterson and helped influence his decision to confess. Rawson would testify about his findings at trial, and the prosecution would also provide testimony by another forensic odontologist, as well as the Coconino County medical examiner, who each believed that the bite mark evidence against Abney was solid. The defense would counter with 3 experts of their own, including the chief forensic odontologist for the state of New Mexico, a pathologist, and the chief medical examiner for the state of Utah, who all testified that the wounds on Sarah's torso were not actually bite marks and had likely been caused by a sharp-edged instrument, such as a dull knife. In fact, the pathologist had even performed an experiment by using a knife on the body of another deceased woman in order to create wounds, which resembled the wounds from Sarah's body. There was also some question about whether Abney had a solid alibi on the night of the crime. During the early stages of the investigation, a man named Guillermo Vasquez told police that on the evening of June the 12th, the same night the murder took place, he stopped by the Flamingo Motel to chat with the clerk, George Bellows, who was Abney's roommate at the time. At some point during the evening, Abney also stopped by the motel and chatted with both of them for the next several hours. Since Vasquez was scheduled to leave on a road trip to San Diego the following morning, Bellows offered to let him spend the night in his room at his residence, so Vasquez and Abney both left the motel at around 2 a.m. on June the 13th and drove there together. Vasquez then said that after sleeping until 6:30 a.m., he woke up and went out to breakfast with Abney before leaving on his trip to San Diego 2 hours later. Now, while Vasquez could not be certain of the exact time Abney arrived at the Flamingo Motel, he did say that Abney appeared shortly before the David Letterman show began airing on the motel television, and that show always started at 11:30 p.m. Since Sarah was last seen alive at the Flagstaff Medical Center at 10:55, and the motel was located on the other side of town, it seemed less likely that Abney could have committed the crime and made it to the motel in that window of time, particularly since Vasquez said Abney did not appear to look nervous or disheveled when he first arrived, and gave off the impression that everything was completely normal. However, investigators believe that Vasquez made too many inconsistent statements to the police to be considered a credible alibi witness, and believed his encounter with Abney might have taken place on a different night besides June the 12th. But Vasquez was positive he got the date right because he left for San Diego the following morning, and was absolutely certain he went to a concert there featuring the gospel troupe, the Continental Singers, on June the 14th, the day after he arrived. Even though George Bellows could corroborate that the lengthy conversation with Vasquez and Abney took place at the Flamingo Motel, he could not recall the exact date or time frame when it occurred. For this reason, the defense elected not to have either Vasquez or Bellows take the stand to testify at Abney's trial. Instead, they attempted another strategy to divert suspicion away from Abney, and when jury selection took place, defense attorney Bruce Griffin surprised everyone during his opening statement when he said, quote, "The marks left on her body and the circumstances surrounding how she was found suggest this was a killing by ritualistic, brace yourselves, witchcraft," end quote. Yes, the defense would present an alternate scenario where Sarah was murdered by the practitioner of a form of witchcraft called Yinaldushi, which is the Navajo translation for animal walker, a beast that they described as being part human, part animal, and part spirit. People who practice Yinaldushi were often known as skinwalkers because they would wear the skins of animals such as coyotes while performing the rituals in order to symbolically transform themselves from human to animal and obtain a wide array of evil powers. I'll go into more details about the lore surrounding skinwalkers later on in this episode, But during this trial, the defense would produce expert testimony from Dr. Barry Tolkien, a folklore professor at Utah State University who had authored works on Navajo witchcraft, and testimony was also provided by a Navajo medicine man named William King. According to Tolkien, some of the stranger details of Sarah's murder were consistent with a ritual killing associated with Navajo witchcraft. For starters, a broken stick which appeared to be in the form of a cross was found lying across Sarah's neck, which Tolkien believed had been carefully placed there as a scepter. He testified that the placement of a stick across the neck symbolized the cutting off of breath, the life stream which Navajos associate with wind, and that her exact cause of death, asphyxiation via suffocation, was consistent with the traditional Navajo slaughtering of animals, stating, quote, "The idea is that smothering converts the inner wind spirit of the animal into something else," end quote. Animal hairs were also found in both Sarah's mouth and her breast wound, which could have been an indicator that her killer was either wearing an animal skin or the hairs were deliberately placed there, as skinwalkers would supposedly use blowpipes to shoot animal hairs into their victims. Tolkien also believed that the wound on the left side of Sarah's chest was intentionally shaped like a crescent moon, a common symbol in Navajo culture which was used in sand paintings and peyote ceremonies of the Native American Church, and he also believed that the removal of the tip of Sarah's left breast pointed to the usage of witchcraft, as those who practiced Yinal Dushi were prone to removing tips of body parts. Another odd piece of evidence was a clump of roots found next to Sarah's pickup truck. Both Tolkien and William King expressed their belief that it might have been quote-unquote grave grass which was taken from a cemetery, as legend has it that Navajo witches would leave signatures at their murder scenes in order to intimidate the victims' families. According to King, these witches used grave grass to quote-unquote foretell the death of people or to cast a spell of death on people. Tolkien also addressed the fact that Sarah's clothing and personal possessions were never found, testifying that Navajo witches were known to bury items belonging to their victims in the graves of others to cause emotional and spiritual havoc on the surviving relatives. The defense attempted to point towards an alternate suspect and presented testimony from a mental health counselor who had spoken with Sarah in the week prior to the murder and heard her express her fear that she was being followed by a man. Sarah's sister, Rosemary Williams, also testified about a conversation they had 4 days before Sarah was killed, where she seemed uncharacteristically fearful and physically trembled while uttering the word "ye," which is the Navajo word for fear. The alternate suspect in question was 53-year-old Frank Nakadene, a practitioner in the Native American Church who lived in the Navajo community of Bodaway Mesa, about 90 miles north of Flagstaff. Frank was an ex-boyfriend of Sarah's who had lived with her 12 years earlier, and some of Sarah's relatives would testify that she once told them Frank had threatened to kill her, and there was an incident where he allegedly left Sarah naked in the snow because she would not loan him money. During the early stages of the investigation, Frank had been ruled out as a suspect because he had an alibi for the night of the murder. Frank claimed that he left his home at around 4:30 p.m. to attend a sweat lodge ceremony with his wife, mother, and other relatives in Tuba City, which is located nearly 80 miles away from Flagstaff. Afterward, he drove back to his home in Bodaway Mesa and arrived at around 1:30 a.m. on June the 13th. This story was corroborated by Frank's brother, who took the stand to testify at the trial, and Frank denied any involvement in Sarah's murder, maintaining that the last time he saw Sarah was about 18 months before the crime took place, and he claimed to have no knowledge of Navajo witchcraft or skinwalker rituals. However, William King just happened to be the medicine man at the sweat lodge, and he testified that Frank was not there that night. Even though Frank often went to the sweat lodge, King claimed that he only ever attended on Sunday nights, whereas the murder took place on a Friday. Well, the case finally went to the jury on July the 19th, and after deliberating for less than 4 hours, they ultimately decided to find Abney not guilty of Sarah's murder. The consensus from the jurors who commented on the verdict was that they believed Abney was gullible and naive, but not a murderer, and they didn't think there was much validity to his confession or the alleged bite mark evidence. According to the jury foreman, since they thought the state's case was completely faulty and full of reasonable doubt, they never even got around to discussing the defense's alternate theory involving Navajo skinwalkers before they voted to acquit Abney. In spite of the acquittal, the Flagstaff Police Department stated that they considered the case to be closed and would not be pursuing any other suspects, but Sarah Saganitso's family did not feel the same way. Believe it or not, the family embraced Abney following the verdict and immediately expressed their support towards him during the post-trial press conference, as Sarah's brother-in-law, Daniel Williams, stated, quote, "On the way, we met a new friend, a friend we never heard of. I hope he forgives us for what many observers thought he was the one. My friends, he is innocent." End quote. Sarah's sister, Rosemary Williams, also made this statement, quote, "They better find some way to reopen the case. The killer is still out there in the street, and has been the whole time." End quote. Abney continued to maintain his innocence and said that he was planning to move to South Carolina to spend time with his parents. Unfortunately, the end of the trial pretty much signaled the end of the investigation and all the media coverage of this case. After 3 decades, no one else has ever been charged with the murder of Sarah Saganitso, and there are no conclusive answers about what happened to her. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to give a shout out to one of my old favorites, Best Fiends. If you've listened to the show these past 2 years, you'll know that I'm obsessed with Best Fiends, and in my humble but correct opinion, it's the best Match 3 style game by far. I mean, I'd say the rest are basically the same game with different color schemes, which is why I'd advise you to stop crushing the same old candy and try a puzzle game with something fresh to offer. What's particularly great about Best Fiends is that you can play through an actual storyline where the cute fiends are the good guys and the not-so-cute slugs are the bad guys. Your friends always start out as wee baby versions of their future selves, and the more you play, the more fiends join your team. And when they become powerful, they'll help you solve increasingly challenging puzzles as you progress through the game. It's an action-packed adventure and a brain-boosting puzzle game all rolled into one, and since new content is added all the time, you'll never get bored. And not to brag or anything, but I've been updating my progress to Best Fiends these past 2 years, and after recently passing the milestone of level 2000, I'm now growing ever so closer to level 2050. Yes, Best Fiends has literally thousands of levels with more of them constantly added all the time, so there's always a fresh challenge waiting for me when I need a mental pick-me-up. Download Best Fiends free today on the App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. So like I mentioned in the intro, there is very little information available about this case online, aside from a few blogs and YouTube videos, which mostly give a very brief synopsis of the story and refer to it as the only known murder trial where the defense tried to allege that a skinwalker was the real killer. But after researching the facts of this case, I learned that the skinwalker aspect was a bit exaggerated and blown out of proportion. When most people think of skinwalkers, they likely picture supernatural creatures which are half man, half animal. You might recall a photograph of a supposed skinwalker going viral on social media in 2014, as it featured an alien-looking creature standing on all fours next to a road in the middle of the night somewhere in New Mexico. But it turned out the whole thing was a hoax, as the photo was actually a still of an alien creature from a 1983 science fiction horror film titled Extro. It's important to note that when George Abney's trial took place, the defense did not try to allege that some sort of alien creature murdered Sarah Saganitso, but rather someone who was practicing Navajo witchcraft and may have been wearing an animal skin when they committed the crime. I think the whole concept of the skinwalker as some sort of supernatural creature started to pick up steam in 1996, when publications started reporting on strange occurrences which were supposedly taking place at a 480-acre ranch in Uintah County, Utah. At the time, it was known as Sherman Ranch since that was the name of the family who lived there, but when they started reporting a lot of paranormal and UFO-related activity taking place, it earned the nickname Skinwalker Ranch and started developing a reputation as being the site of an interdimensional doorway used by alien shapeshifters. The family's patriarch, Terry Sherman, reported an incident where he was out walking his dogs one night when he came across what appeared to be a wolf, except that it was 3 times larger than its normal size and had glowing red eyes. The Shermans also reported that a number of their cows went missing or were found badly mutilated, leading to speculation that this mysterious wolf-like creature, which may or may not have been a skinwalker, was responsible. Over the past 25 years, there have been over 100 reports of strange, unexplained incidents at Skinwalker Ranch, but that's a topic for another podcast. It really doesn't have a whole lot to do with the original Navajo legend involving skinwalkers and has no bearing on this particular case. Long story short, I don't think a shape-shifting creature traveled from Utah to Flagstaff, Arizona to kill Sarah Saganitso. All that being said, even though Abney's attorneys did not attempt to pin the crime on a shape-shifting creature, it initially seemed pretty odd to me that they referenced skinwalkers as part of their defense strategy at trial, and it actually led to an acquittal. To be honest, when I started researching this story, I went in completely blind, so my initial impression was that the defense must have been pretty desperate, and Abney was probably guilty as sin, and lucked out at getting one of the dumbest, most gullible juries imaginable. But once I learned the full facts of this case, it became apparent that even if the whole skinwalker angle had not been introduced at all, the jury likely still would have found Abney not guilty. The case against him was pretty problematic, and relied almost entirely on his confession and bite mark evidence. In the 3 decades since this trial took place, we're now a lot more aware of how many wrongful convictions have resulted from false confessions and bite mark evidence which has since been discredited. And I think an important detail which gets overlooked in the retellings of the story is that the jury did not acquit Abney because they believed the skinwalker theory. The foreman made it very clear that they did not even discuss this theory during their deliberations, as they simply reached their verdict because there was too much reasonable doubt in the prosecution's case. If the defense had attempted to say that aliens or Bigfoot or the Mothman committed this crime, it may have ultimately made no difference, and the verdict could have been exactly the same. I think it says a lot that after Abney was found not guilty, Sarah Saganitso's family embraced him and openly expressed their belief that he was innocent, and the jury got it right. That sort of thing is extraordinarily rare in criminal trials, as a victim's family will often still believe that the defendant was guilty all along, even if they were acquitted. So I get the impression that they must have had their doubts about Abney throughout the trial, and I'd be curious to know if Sarah's family had their own thoughts about who they believed actually killed her. Sadly, even though they pushed for the investigation to be reopened, the local authorities still held to their belief that they got the right guy the first time around, so there hasn't been any attempt to explore alternate suspects these past 3 decades. In fact, it sounds like the authorities were much more concerned about their public image, as the lead detective, Gerald Blair, and Coconino County Attorney John Verkamp, who later became a member of the Arizona Senate and the Arizona House of Representatives, wrote angry letters to the Arizona Daily Sun, accusing them of biased reporting during the trial, which they believed was favorable towards Abney. One of the more ridiculous statements Verkamp made was how it was incredibly suspicious that Abney did not take the stand to testify in his own defense, even though many attorneys will advise their clients against that, no matter how innocent they may be. It's clear there was some major tunnel vision among the authorities in Coconino County, and nothing was going to change their minds. Now, I'm not going to try and say that I know 100% for a fact that Abney did not commit this crime, but researching this story, I just saw so many red flags that I recognized from other wrongful conviction cases. This is far from the only example I've seen where police zeroed in on a suspect who had talked about having weird dreams, which they thought might have been repressed memories. Once the suspects were interrogated, they became convinced the dreams were reality and that they had blacked out and committed a horrible murder without remembering it. So this eventually led to them making a confession and being charged with the crime. There are so many parallels between this case and the 1996 murder of Jessica Bagan, which I covered on episode 107 of The Trail Went Cold. In that case, the victim was from Alaska and was also asphyxiated, and a suspect named Robert Bingham turned himself into the police because he believed he was having flashbacks to having killed her, and after being interrogated, he made a videotaped confession and was charged with murder. But of course, it turned out that none of the physical evidence matched Bingham, and some of the details he provided in his confession were inaccurate. So when he went on trial, the prosecution's entire case hinged on this faulty confession, but the jury didn't buy it and wound up finding him not guilty. Sound familiar? However, the big difference between these two cases is that they had DNA evidence from Jessica Baggins' murder, and last year, it was finally matched to another suspect, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Bingham did not commit this crime. Unfortunately, since Sarah Saganitso's murder took place in 1987, when DNA profiling was still in its infancy, I'm not sure if any DNA evidence was ever preserved. But there are a number of parallels between the interrogations of George Abney and Robert Bingham and how they were manipulated into making a confession. Bingham said he was suffering from anxiety attacks, so one of the detectives told him they were a quote-unquote message from God and that he needed to admit to what he did to earn a clean slate. Well, Abney also stated that these weird dreams he were having were a quote-unquote message from God, and the main reason he popped up on the radar as a suspect was because he shared some incriminating statements with a minister, Floyd Patterson, who was actually allowed inside the interrogation room to counsel Abney and likely made him think that confessing was the right thing to do, even though Abney may not have actually done what they believed he did. The idea of thinking you committed a crime but blocked out all memory of the event is pretty terrifying, but it's just one of the many reasons why innocent people will make false confessions. And of course, the other major piece of evidence against Abney were the bite marks on Sarah's chest, which supposedly matched his dental impressions. But even though they were considered to be strong forensic evidence in 1987 because their role in helping convict Ted Bundy, we now know that it is flawed science. When I came across a newspaper article about this case which had the headline, quote, "Expert says bite mark as good as a fingerprint," alarm bells started going off in my head. Research has since shown that the skin's elastic properties can make it a bad medium for accurately recording teeth impressions. One of the more infamous examples of a wrongful conviction based largely on bite mark evidence also took place in Arizona, as a man named Ray Crone wound up receiving the death penalty for the 1991 murder of a woman named Kim Ancona. The killer had left bite marks on the victim's breast and neck, and Crone was convicted on supposed expert testimony which stated that the marks matched Crone's dental impressions. Even when Crone's conviction was overturned and he received a new trial a few years later, he wound up being convicted a second time on the bite mark testimony, and it was not until 2002 when DNA testing was performed on saliva and blood which was left behind in Ancona's body. The DNA wound up matching a convicted sex offender named Kenneth Phillips, and Crone was finally exonerated of the crime. Well, the odontology expert who testified about the bite mark evidence in the Crone case was Dr. Raymond Rawson, and this was not the only wrongful conviction in which he was asked to provide his analysis. And since Dr. Rawson's bite mark analysis was one of the main pieces of evidence which led to George Abney's arrest, you can understand why this is problematic. Interestingly enough, before the case went to trial, Abney's defense team sought the advice of Dr. Walter Birkby, the director of the Forensic Anthropology Department at the University of Arizona, who believed that bite mark evidence was controversial and quote-unquote not without its errors. If that name sounds familiar, you might recognize Dr. Birkby from Unsolved Mysteries, as he was featured in their segment about the disappearances of Glenn and Bessie Hyde, performing tests to determine if a human skull which had been found matched Glenn. What adds an extra element of controversy to this case is that the defense presented testimony from their own expert witnesses who did not believe that the wounds on Sarah's chest were even bite marks at all, but were actually made by a knife, which if accurate, would have rendered the evidence completely pointless. It's kind of ironic, because Abney had actually mentioned stabbing Sarah during his original confession, but the prosecution ignored this detail to focus on the alleged bite mark evidence. I guess the other piece of evidence which leans towards Abney being innocent is that he was allegedly having a conversation with two alibi witnesses, Guillermo Vasquez and George Bellows, at an entirely different location during the approximate time period Sarah was killed. When I first read Vasquez's account of these events, they were so detailed that I found it to be credible, and it made it sound impossible that Abney could have committed the crime in such a narrow time frame. However, it's worth reiterating that neither of these witnesses were called upon to testify at trial, as Bellows could not be certain his conversation with Abney occurred on the same night as the murders, and the authorities thought Vasquez made enough inconsistent statements that he may have been mistaken about the date when all this took place. For all we know, Vasquez could have been 100% accurate, but the defense may have thought it was too risky for him to be cross-examined by the prosecution on the witness stand, so they thought their case was better served by focusing on other evidence which provided reasonable doubt against Abney. But say what you want about this strategy, or the defense's decision to introduce skinwalkers into the trial, and that doesn't change the fact that it led to Abney being acquitted, so they obviously did an effective job. Overall, there is just very little evidence that Abney was responsible for this crime, as I don't get the impression that he had any history of violence in his background, or any motive to attack and brutally murder a random woman he didn't even know while she was leaving her workplace late that night. I get more of a vibe that he was just a confused, troubled man who was going through other psychological issues at the time, but if he was truly innocent, I hope that Abney has been able to spend the past 3 decades living in peace. So now we're going to spend the rest of this episode focusing on the crime itself, as well as the victim, Sarah Saganitso. While it's standard practice for me to always use a picture of the victim as the cover photo for each episode, I unfortunately had no luck finding one photograph of Sarah anywhere, not even in the dozens of newspaper articles I read about this case. There really isn't all that much information available about her background, only that she was a hard-working single mother with a young son, who had been at the same job for 17 years, and it sounds like she was a reliable employee who mostly kept to herself. But I can't help but think it's not a coincidence that after spending most of her tenure working the day shift and undergoing 6 weeks of retraining, she just happened to be murdered after completing her very first night shift. Well, 1 month after the crime, a former Navajo employee at the Flagstaff Medical Center who had been terminated the previous November filed a lawsuit against the hospital and the director of housekeeping, alleging they had committed breach of contract and racial discrimination. She claimed that she had performed her job well for many years, but when this director became her new supervisor, he started increasing her workload and giving her all these extra tasks, such as keeping charts and records, which would not have been her strong point because she did not know much English. Indeed, one of the reasons Sarah was assigned to take 6 weeks of retraining was to improve her English reading and writing skills. Some other employees from the hospital anonymously told the Arizona Daily Sun that these retraining sessions were a ploy to get rid of the Navajo staff, as the director may have hoped it would compel them to quit and save the hospital the trouble of firing them. I have no idea if these allegations were true, but Sarah still completed her retraining sessions and moved to the night shift, even if she might not have been overly thrilled by it. I'm not trying to allege that Sarah's murder was some sort of hate crime motivated by racism, but this would have been the first shift which required her to leave the hospital late at night to walk towards her pickup truck. So I have to wonder if someone out there knew this and took advantage of the situation. It does seem likely that the killer attacked Sarah after she left the building and dragged her to the nearby wooded area, but was she the victim of some random predator and simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was this some sort of personal killing? Well, we had testimony at Abney's trial from experts on Navajo culture who believed that there were details about the murder scene which suggested that she was a victim of a skinwalker practicing a form of Navajo witchcraft called Yinal-Dushi, though the state had their own counter-arguments for many of these points. There was a stick lying across Sarah's neck which appeared to be in the shape of a cross, which the defense believed had been placed there as some sort of symbolic gesture, but the prosecution argued that since this was a wooded area filled with trees and sticks, it could have wound up there inadvertently. The wounds on Sarah's chest appeared to be carved in the shape of a crescent moon, but that may not have been anything more than a coincidence. The tip of Sarah's left breast had been removed, which was another practice supposedly consistent with Yinal-Dushi, though under cross-examination, Barry Tolkien did admit that he could cite only one other known case where a breast was cut off in a suspected act of witchcraft. There was also a clump of grass next to Sarah's pickup truck, which was believed to be grave grass from a cemetery and had been left there to send a message to her family, as well as the presence of a couple of animal hairs on Sarah's body. I mean, it's possible that all these details were taken completely out of context and don't have any real connection to the crime, but I do think it's odd that the killer went to the trouble of taking Sarah's clothing and all of her personal items away from the scene while making no attempt to conceal her body. Even though all her clothes were removed, it does not appear that Sarah was sexually assaulted, so it was theorized that the killer made the deliberate choice to go elsewhere and bury every single thing Sarah had on her, which is apparently another tactic by those who practice Navajo witchcraft when they commit murder. The entire crime seems to defy all standard logic, so you can understand why the whole skinwalker theory entered the equation. Well, before we talk more about that angle, we have to discuss two other murders which took place in Flagstaff during this time period. Since both these crimes took place 2 months after George Abney was arrested and had apparent similarities to Sarah's murder, his attorneys attempted to argue that they were all the work of some serial killer who was still out there. During the early morning hours of November the 7th, 1987, 24-year-old Northern Arizona University student Ina Claire Langstaff was found dead outside her apartment after she was stabbed 20 times. 4 days later, on November the 11th, a 23-year-old pregnant woman named Rita Breyer was strangled to death with a necktie inside her apartment, and the perpetrator had attempted to gouge her eyes out, sexually assaulted her after she was dead, and left bite marks on her body. It wasn't long before Breyer's live-in boyfriend, John George Brewer, was arrested for the crime, and he was even questioned about his possible role in Sarah Saganitso's murder. Well, given that Abney had already been charged with that crime, his defense attorneys took this as a sign that the police were not confident they had gotten the right man. However, investigators ruled out Brewer as a suspect in Sarah's case, since he was living in Pennsylvania at the time her murder took place, and he would be executed for Rita Breyer's murder in March of 1993, becoming the first inmate in the history of Arizona to die of lethal injection. As for the murder of Ina Claire Langstaff, it is still unsolved to this day, and while I'm not sure if investigators have ever uncovered any solid potential suspects, they have expressed their belief that this crime is not connected to Sarah's death. So the individual whom Abney's defense team pointed to as an alternate suspect at his trial was a Navajo ex-boyfriend of Sarah's named Frank Nakadene, who had lived with her for a time during the 1970s. Well, it sounds like Frank did not treat Sarah that well. It had been 12 years since they broke up, and Frank maintained that the last time he saw her was about 18 months prior to her death. Even if Frank had been abusive and violent, you have to wonder if he really would have been compelled to murder Sarah over a decade after they originally broke up, especially since he lived about 90 miles away from Flagstaff. Of course, since it's a defense attorney's job to generate reasonable doubt by any means possible, you can understand why Abney's attorneys would have pointed the finger at Frank, even if the evidence against him wasn't particularly strong. The biggest issue is that Frank apparently had an alibi, placing him and his family at a sweat lodge ceremony in Tuba City on the night of the murder, which is around 80 miles away, and Frank's brother testified to his whereabouts and corroborated that Frank returned to his home in Bodaway Mesa after the ceremony was over. However, William King, the medicine man at the sweat lodge ceremony, testified that Frank was not there on the evening of June the 12th, 1987. In fact, King sounded downright angry and insulted that Frank had attempted to use him as an alibi, stating on the witness stand, quote, "He lied about me, the lodge, and the grandfathers." Now, according to King, Navajo culture defines grandfathers as, quote-unquote, what your Bible calls angels. They are spirits that come back to help us. In fact, King said the grandfathers had led him to the spot where Sarah was murdered without anyone else telling him the exact location. King also testified that the grandfathers had directed him to make a sketch of the killer, and when he showed it to Sarah's sister, Rosemary, she identified the person in the sketch as being Frank Nakadene. So on the one hand, it sounds like Frank does have witnesses backing up his alibi on the night of the murder, but since they were family members, would they have been willing to lie for him? On the other hand, King said that he usually saw between 20 and 100 people per night at the sweat lodge, but never kept a list of them. So could he have been mistaken about Frank being there on June the 12th? It's worth mentioning that according to Navajo folklore, a skinwalker can be produced if a medicine man decides to abuse magic for evil and corrupts the natural order of things. Could it be possible that King's opinion about Frank was skewed a little bit because he genuinely believed that Frank used Navajo witchcraft to perform an evil act, which is a perversion of the good works that traditional medicine men like King perform? I think the most important detail, which would point towards or away from Frank's potential involvement, is whether or not he had knowledge of Sarah's shift change at the Flagstaff Medical Center. Like I mentioned earlier, Sarah spent the better part of 17 years working the day shift, and she was killed after working her very first night shift. Unless Frank somehow found out that Sarah was working a different shift, there would be no reason for him to believe she would be leaving the hospital at 11 p.m. that night. Now, we do have reports of Sarah appearing to be frightened and believing that a man was following her in the week prior to her death, and if that's true, then it's possible that her killer was watching the hospital, and when he saw Sarah walking outside alone after her shift ended, he took advantage of the situation and attacked her. But whether or not Frank was the man following Sarah is unclear, as he lived 80 miles away, and I'm not sure he could be placed in the Flagstaff area during this time period. There's just not enough information about Frank Nakadene to know if he's a plausible suspect. However, I do believe it is likely that Sarah was killed by someone who was following and stalking her, but was this person a practitioner of Navajo witchcraft, aka a skinwalker? I do find it interesting how quickly Sarah's family came to George Abney's defense following the trial, as you get the sense that they had already gotten it into their heads that he was innocent before the verdict was even read. Perhaps there was something about this alternate scenario involving skinwalkers which rang true to them, which is why they came to believe that Sarah's killer was Navajo and not a white man like Abney. It's incredibly sad that in spite of the family's request for a new investigation, the authorities decided to close the case. They knew that because of double jeopardy, they would never be able to take Abney to trial again, so their mentality was that there was nothing more they could do, and they refused to acknowledge the possibility that someone else committed the crime. Since there's not been any further investigation or media coverage of this case for over 30 years, we are just left with so many unanswered questions. I still don't know if there's any available DNA evidence for this crime, but if there is, all the authorities would have to do is enter it into a genealogy database, and there's a chance it could lead to a match with the perpetrator. It's just really sad to me that not only did Sarah Saganitso never receive justice, but there is just so little information available about her online, and it seems like she is mostly a footnote in what has become a greatly exaggerated spooky story about skinwalkers. But that doesn't change the fact that she was a real person who was the victim of a real crime, and regardless of what the motive was, or whether or not the murder was linked to Navajo witchcraft, the killer has gotten away with it. So if you happen to have any information on the murder of Sarah Saganitso, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Last month, we released a sequel to a popular Patreon episode we did a few years ago titled The Trail Went Hot, and this time, I go over a number of cases which were featured in articles I wrote for listverse.com over the years and have since wound up being solved. As a token of appreciation for recently cracking the milestone of 500 Patreon supporters, we are making this particular episode available to all of our patrons in tiers 1, 2, and 3. I'm also going to be dropping the occasional exclusive bonus Patreon episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, and we recently released an episode in which myself and my co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discussed the unsolved abduction of Angela Hammond. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Grace S., Lori K., and Laura. Thank you all so much for your support. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode, and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information, or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the ear music you hear on every episode. And as I'm sure you noticed, our special Halloween version of the Trail Went Cold theme has played on the soundtrack of our episodes throughout the month of October. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and a happy Halloween, and join us again in November for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.